Great. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar on accessible municipal meetings. I'm Julia O'Leary. I'm the General Counsel here at Massachusetts Office on Disability. I am joined today by Ann Lynch, who is an Assistant Attorney General and the Disability Rights Coordinator for the Attorney General's Office. And we're going to talk today about how to make your municipal meetings, including your public meetings and your town meetings, if you're a town, accessible to people with disabilities. Right. So we're going to start off with an overview of the disability laws. We're going to then talk about reasonable modifications, what those are, what the process looks like, what it's going to look like at an open meeting, public meeting, what it's going to look like at a town meeting, and then go over best practices for all meetings. And finally, we've got a page at the end that is a list of resources. Most of you received a copy of the deck on Monday, so you have this resource page already. If you signed up after I sent it on Monday, we're going to send a follow-up email with another copy of the deck and a recording of this so that you have that for your reference. If you have questions, we're going to take questions at the end, so please put them in the Q&A box. And you can either type in your question there, or if you have a question, raise your hand at the end, and Lilia, who is our communications director here at MOD, will call on you and facilitate those questions. We do have CART transcription available, so if that will be coming through as closed captioning, so if you need closed captioning, go ahead and turn that on. If there's any sort of Zoom troubleshooting issues that you need help with, feel free to put something in the chat, and Lilia from my team will assist you. All right, so let's get started with the fun stuff, the law, which is what Ann and I are here for. So on the federal side, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is really the basis for most of what we're going to talk about here today. The ADA was passed in 1990. It prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability, and it applies to different kinds of entities, including state and local government entities. So Title II of the ADA is the title that applies to you as municipal officials, and that's the title that we're going to be really talking about in today's presentation. The ADA was amended in 2008 in order to clarify that the statute is intended to be interpreted broadly. So both the definition of disability under the ADA is intended to be interpreted broadly, and the protective measures under the ADA, the non-discrimination requirement, is also intended to be interpreted broadly. So, as you're sort of looking at the ADA, maybe your town council is looking at the case law, it's important to be aware that how the ADA is interpreted needs to shift post-2008, so you should be looking at the newer cases. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act is the statute that applies to federal programs, but also to programs that receive federal funding. So any programs that you have in your town that are federally funded are also going to be covered by Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which also prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability. And both the ADA and the Rehabilitation Act require that covered entities provide reasonable accommodations to people with disabilities to allow them to fully access those government services and programs. And Anne is going to talk about the Massachusetts side.
Hello, everyone. This is Anne speaking. On the state side, there are several laws that might come into play when we're talking about municipalities. These include Article 114 of the Massachusetts Constitution, which reads, "No otherwise qualified disabled individual shall solely by the reason of their disability be excluded from the participation in, denied the benefits of, or be subject to discrimination under any program or activity within the Commonwealth." This is obviously an incredibly sweeping constitutional provision that broadly requires the inclusion of disabled individuals in all of our municipal activities. There's also the Massachusetts Equal Rights Law, which can be found at General Laws, Chapter 93, Section 103, the Massachusetts Public Accommodation Law, which can be found at General Laws, Chapter 272, Sections 92A and 98. And finally, the Service Animal Law might come into play, and that can be found at General Laws, Chapter 272, Section 98A. Next slide. So first, let's talk about what is a disability under the ADA. The term disability under the ADA means any one of the following things. First, a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity of an individual, or a record of having a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity, or being regarded as having a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. So obviously these definitions invite a three-part inquiry. Is there a physical or mental impairment? Is it substantially limiting? And does it affect a major life activity? Regarding the first question, there's really no exhaustive list of impairments, but I think you'll hear Julia and I say throughout today, this law is meant to be broad and inclusive because there's no way to anticipate really the breadth of impairments we may encounter on a day-to-day basis. Regarding the second question of what substantially limiting means, again, this law is meant to be broad and inclusive. The Northeast ADA Center explains that this doesn't necessarily mean a severe condition. Rather, it's just a condition that creates an impairment when compared to most people in the population. And again, we're looking to interpret this broadly. It should be interpreted broadly. And finally, what is a major life activity? These are functions that are important to most people's daily lives. The list includes, and this is the list from the 2008 amendments, caring for oneself, performing manual tasks, seeing, hearing, eating, sleeping, walking, standing, speaking, breathing, learning, concentrating, communicating, and working. You can tell by the activities here that, again, it's meant to be very broad and encompassing. It also incorporates major bodily functions, like the function of the immune system, your digestive, bowel or bladder function, your reproductive function, your respiratory function. So all of this really speaks to the fact that the definition of disability is broad and inclusive. Now I'm going to turn it over to Julia.
All right. So we're really going to be focusing on Title II of the ADA as well as Massachusetts laws today. Title II of the ADA applies to state and local governments and prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability. So the quote from the Act is, "No qualified individual with a disability shall, by reason of such disability, be excluded from participation in or be denied the benefits of the services, programs, or activities of a public entity or subjected to discrimination by such entity." What this means is as state and local government entities, we can't discriminate on the basis of disability when we're administering our programs, or our services, or sort of in the construction of our buildings. I mean, we also need to make sure that all these things are accessible, proactively accessible to people with disabilities. And one way that we're going to accomplish that is by providing reasonable accommodations upon request. And we're going to go in a couple slides into more detail on what we mean by reasonable accommodations. But first, we're going to talk a little bit about the Massachusetts laws.
This is Anne again. So as Julia indicated, our state laws really largely track the federal laws, and our interpretation of our laws are really guided by interpretations of federal laws. But sometimes our state laws provide more specific protections. And a very classic and simple example of this is under the ADA in general, covered entities, which includes municipalities, but they must modify their policies to allow service animals. A lot of our buildings don't allow animals inside, but we're required to modify that policy to allow service animals. And just as a reminder, because I myself can always use a reminder of the two magic questions, a service animal is a dog that's trained to work or perform tasks for a person with a disability. In determining whether an animal is a service animal, you can only ask two questions. This is what I always need a reminder of. Is the service animal required because of the disability, and what work or tasks has it been trained to perform? Those are the two questions, and we cannot require proof or documentation, only ask those two questions. So that's the law under the ADA. But under the Massachusetts service animal law, there's a specific fine, a $300 fine, if someone denies access to a guide dog or a person with a physical disability because of their guide dog. So that just makes it much more concrete and puts in a specific penalty for a violation of the law that's not present in the federal laws. Next slide, please. So as Julia indicated, one way we ensure that our programs are accessible is through reasonable modifications. And what's a reasonable modification? Well, first of all, I should have said, often you'll hear the term reasonable accommodation. And in this context, we mean the same thing. In the housing context, they have a different meaning, but here folks may just be using them interchangeably because they're familiar with the term reasonable accommodation and less so with the term reasonable modification. So if you hear either, you're in this world of reasonable modification. And what a reasonable modification is an adjustment or alteration to a public entity's policies, practices, or procedures that enables a person with a disability to access that public entity's service program or activity. Now let's get specific and give those words meaning. So a reasonable modification can include auxiliary aids or services. Auxiliary aids or services are communication aids. So really classic examples of these are ensuring that our electronic materials can be read by folks who use screen reader programs, and providing American Sign Language interpreters during meetings and events, because those things aid our communication. Another example of reasonable modifications or category is the removal of barriers. So examples of this are installing automatic door paddles at your entrances or in other areas where the public needs to move around, and moving a meeting to a physically accessible location. Another category of reasonable modifications has to do with alterations to those policies, practices, and procedures. And here, classic examples are allowing service animals to accompany constituents visiting government offices or events, and now more so than ever, remote participation in meetings. There are really countless examples of reasonable modifications that folks might request. And again, the intent of the law is to be broad and creative, so that we can meet the needs of individuals with disabilities who are really in the best position to identify what their needs are and what meets their needs. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Julia.
All right, thanks, Anne. So what do you do as a municipality when you get one of these requests for a reasonable modification? Typically, your municipality is required by law to have an ADA coordinator who's responsible for coordinating these requests. So your ADA coordinator for your municipality will be the point person for receiving and sort of coordinating the process for reviewing and responding to this request for reasonable modification. The first thing that ADA coordinator needs to do is determine whether or not this is a request for a reasonable modification under the ADA. So is this a person with a disability who's asking for a change related to a government policy, practice, procedure in order to be able to access a government program, service, or activity? If the answer to that question is yes, you're talking about a reasonable modification. The next step is you have to determine sort of whether or not that reasonable modification request is reasonable. And in most circumstances, the default under Title II is that it's probably going to be reasonable unless that change would fundamentally alter the nature of the public meeting or town meeting, or if it would be unduly burdensome, either financially or administratively, to effectuate that request. So if it wouldn't be a fundamental alteration to the meeting, you should provide it. If it would fundamentally alter the meeting, then you need to have a discussion with the requester about alternatives. And that process is called the interactive process or the interactive dialogue. And it's a really important part of the ADA and of compliance with the ADA, because showing that you have engaged in that interactive process is a defense if this was going to proceed to litigation. So, showing that you tried to engage in the interactive process, tried to find a solution, is going to be your next step there. But you want to make sure, especially in the context of meetings and events, you want to make sure that you're responding to these reasonable modification requests in a timely manner, so that your failure to respond to the request isn't preventing someone from attending the meeting, right? So try to streamline the process for reviewing and approving these requests so that you can get them sorted before the meeting is scheduled to take place. Because that's really important, both for accessibility from a disability perspective, but also accessibility from a sort of public engagement perspective, right? You want the folks in your municipality to be able to participate meaningfully in their government. And this is a really important part of that, because if you can't get in the door to participate, you're not going to be able to avail yourself of your right to meaningfully participate in government the way that non-disabled residents would be able to. So really important that this is dealt with before the meeting so that it can provide meaningful access to your constituents. So we're going to go over some best practices for all meetings. This applies to any meeting that your town is running, or your city is running. So if it's an open meeting, if it's a hearing, if it's a town meeting, any kind of event that you guys are holding, you want to, make sure that your municipal staff are regularly trained on laws relating to accessibility for people with disabilities. And that includes board and committee members, so they can be aware of how they're running their meetings to make sure that they're thinking about accessibility. So this training today is going to be recorded. Feel free to send the recording link to all of your board and committee members, all of your municipal staff that regularly manage meetings, and have them watch it and start thinking about how to make those meetings more accessible. It's really important to think proactively about accessibility because the earlier you plan ahead, the easier it's going to be to implement certain measures that'll make your meetings more accessible. For example, plan ahead for communication access, such as live transcription through CART services, and we CART today, or through ASL interpretation. Booking those communication access resources ahead of time is really essential to make sure that you have a resource available on the day of your event. If you're booking through a service like Mass Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, make sure that you're booking those at least 2 weeks in advance in order to allow enough time to get the resource available for the event. You should also think ahead about physical access. Make sure that you're planning your event for a location that is physically accessible to everyone. If you can't find a physically accessible location, try harder. Be creative about what kind of venue you could host your meeting in that would be physically accessible to everyone, and set up your meeting rooms in a way that's going to promote physical access. A really important part of accessibility is making sure that people know how to ask for reasonable accommodations or modifications. And part of that is including contact information for your municipality's ADA coordinator on meeting notices, so that people know how to ask for what they need to meaningfully participate. It's also good practice to have that contact information posted really obviously on your website, so that folks who want to get engaged in government know how to ask for accommodations in order to make that engagement accessible for them. To the extent possible, ensure that any information that you're posting on your website relating to a meeting, including any presentation materials, agendas, PowerPoint presentations, if there's going to be PowerPoint presentations shared, are accessible and usable by people with disabilities. So make sure that those are, screen reader accessible. Make sure that they can be navigated by keyboard only. We have a lot of resources here at Mass Office on Disability to help you, sort of assess the accessibility of some of your digital resources. So feel free to reach out to us. We have a training video on our website as well that gives you some pointers about this. But it's really important that the electronic material that you're presenting about your meetings be accessible to people with disabilities. If you're showing a video or image during the meeting, and a lot of times, at planning board meetings, zoning meetings, you're going to be looking at a lot of maps, charts, photos. Make sure that those visual components of a meeting are described verbally, so that people who can't see the images still understand what's going on and have context for what's being discussed in the meeting. If you post a map and say, well, if I draw a line over here and then highlight, this area in blue, then we can totally fit the number of cars in this parking lot, right? That's not going to be helpful orientation for someone who can't visually see the material. So try to be verbally descriptive of visually presented material. That also includes videos. And so make sure that if you're providing, online material, that there is alternative text for any images and audio descriptions for any videos. And Anne is going to talk about CART and ASL interpretation.
This is Anne again. Just when Julia was speaking, it reminded me that we didn't do our own visual description. So as an example of what she just talked about, often in meetings, you'll hear folks who are speaking give a visual description of themselves, which is similar to describing a photo or a map that's being used in a meeting. So I might say that I'm a middle-aged woman with a short brown bob, wearing black glasses and a black suit jacket in front of a blurred background. And that's the kind of description of an image to start with. Also, you'll notice we've tried to identify who's talking at all times by saying, turning it over to Julia, this is Anne, turning it over to Anne, to help folks who may not be able to see the video recognize the voice that's being said. And that's another meeting moderation point that can really help folks with visual impairments follow the flow of the meeting. So now we're going to dig into CART and ASL interpretation that Julia kind of previewed. But I think as a baseline, it's really important to acknowledge that folks with hearing impairments benefit from different aids and services. So some deaf individuals do not benefit at all from captioning or CART. Some do. Some folks who are deaf, who are hard of hearing, do not benefit from sign language interpretation. And many of us are familiar with American Sign Language. Maybe we've seen CODA or been at meetings with interpreters, but it's important to remember that there are numerous sign languages used both in this country and around the world. There was a fabulous piece in the New York Times, I think last year, talking about actually just dialects of ASL in the United States and different signs used in different regions by different populations. It's an incredibly rich linguistic tradition. So it's really crucial to figure out what will accommodate an individual with a hearing impairment, because it's going to be very individual based on what their needs are. So first, what is CART? CART stands for Communication Access Real-Time Translation. And CART really is real-time captioning performed by a professional. There are a lot of auto captions now. I think we're all getting more familiar with those. And we know that those can be flawed. They can be pretty good, or they can be deeply flawed. But CART is captioning done by a professional, much more like a steno at court. Whereas ASL interpretation is a person who provides American Sign Language interpretation. And there are other sign language interpreters out there for other sign languages. And both CART and ASL can be done either in person or virtually. So here for this meeting, the CART is being done virtually. We could have a virtual ASL interpreter, but we can also have meetings where the ASL interpreter is live. And if there's also remote participation, we could pin the ASL interpreter on the screen to provide remote access to the live interpretation. So, and as Julia already mentioned, it's really important to think about CART and ASL interpreters really early. The Massachusetts Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing is an excellent resource on this. There are other private providers, but the Commission really is an excellent resource and has a statewide referral service. The last time I personally requested services through MCDHH, it was a really easy online form. I often request for both CART and ASL. So I do 2 requests and I usually do them simultaneously. So here's a pro tip, which is you really should label that they're not duplicative, that you're requesting CART and then you're requesting ASL and they're not the same if you're doing them simultaneously. Further, as Julia already signaled, there's a real shortage of interpreters and professionals who can provide CART services in the Commonwealth. And because of this, it's really important to get your requests in as soon as possible. And our suggested best practice is really to reserve both of these services as soon as possible for every meeting that either you anticipate significant public participation in, or where you'll have constituents who need these services. The Mass Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing has really indicated to us that it's better to schedule these services out for meetings than to wait and make a last minute request. And that they would prefer you have the reservation in place and that you cancel it if you determine that the services aren't needed, rather than need it last minute and everyone's scrambling to try and find someone, because that's just been so difficult lately. So you can cancel reservations for these services up to 2 business days prior to the event. So next slide, please. So we're just going to touch in a little more depth on best practices for in-person meetings again. And Julia already hit on a few of these things. But I think the guiding, there are a couple guiding principles. And first is to think about accessibility early and often. So ideally, you're going to assess accessibility as a matter of course, as a part of the meeting planning, the same way you put out meeting notices or anything else that you have a routine for or a checklist for in your office, that this would be on that checklist to assess your accessibility. And you would have a plan in place for how to accomplish it so that you're ahead of the game and not responding to last minute requests and getting frazzled, because I know that those things frazzle me. So another really guiding principle is that there should be no segregation. Meetings should be held in a space that's physically accessible to all, which is why Julia said earlier, if your building isn't accessible, if your meeting location isn't accessible, try harder, find another place. Because the principle is no segregation. Meetings should really be held in the most integrated setting that's appropriate to the needs of the individual with the disabilities. So a separate accessible space should only be considered or offered if that is in fact what's necessary to meet the needs of the individual with the disability, because the guiding principle is integration. So again, it's crucial to consider physical accessibility. A good resource for assessing physical accessibility is the 2010 ADA Accessibility Standards and the MAAB standards. A simple checklist might include, making sure your buildings are accessible, having a meeting on the first floor, if at all possible, to eliminate, lines and crammed up elevators, to ensure that your hallways and meeting rooms are free from obstructions, to remember related concerns like accessible bathrooms and accessible parking, to think about your seating arrangements and anticipate folks who use wheelchairs or other mobility devices, and to think about lighting and sound. Does your room need a mic? Do you need other auxiliary aids? Is it bright enough? Or if you have folks that need less light, to try and think about all the needs of the constituents in your community. If your municipality has an outstanding accessibility project, I'm not involved in this, but I know that Maude has a municipal ADA grant cycle annually that awards money to towns and municipalities that have accessibility projects. So if you're looking to do something, because you are constantly having to overcome an accessibility issue, they may be able to help with that. So along with physical accessibility, it's also, again, incredibly important to consider programmatic accessibility. And these, obviously, you don't have to make an accommodation if it amounts to a fundamental alteration. But there are so many reasonable modifications to policies, procedures, and practices that come nowhere close to fundamental alterations and truly increase accessibility. So again, classic examples of these are allowing service animals and adding assistive listening systems into conference rooms and hearing rooms to improve sound quality for folks who have hearing impairments. Next slide, please. So that was for in-person meetings. And now we're going to talk a little bit more about accessibility best practices for remote meetings or meetings in which there is remote participation, which does not necessarily make a meeting a remote meeting or a hybrid. So first I'll say there are a lot of really good guides out there for how to maximize the accessibility of a remote meeting or remote participation. I've used them myself because I had no idea how to do this until 3 years ago, and I'm still learning. So one that's kind of the gold standard was developed by the World Wide Web Consortium, which is also referred to as W3C, and I believe it's in our resources list at the end. Another that I really liked that you could Google if you were interested is one published by the American Bar Association, and it was called Virtual Meetings, Accessibility Checklist and Best Practices. And it was just really like usable, user-friendly, easy to understand, and very practical. But ultimately, again, you're going to be on the right path if you're just planning and considering early and often accessibility as you approach the entire meeting, whatever form that meeting takes. So in a remote meeting or in a meeting with remote participation, the first consideration will be what platform you use. Are you going to use the old-fashioned telephone, or are you going to use a video conferencing tool like we're using today with Zoom? If you're using a video conferencing tool, which one? We know there's WebEx, there's Zoom, there's Teams, there are probably others, and each one has different accessibility tools. What features does the video conferencing tool you're looking at using have? What are its captioning options? How good is its auto captioning? Some of them play well with CART, and some, my understanding is, don't play as well with CART. So if you need CART, it's important to consider, does your platform work well with CART? Can you pin an ASL interpreter or a speaker? Are there keyboard shortcuts for folks who don't use a mouse or who aren't have difficulty with point and click type features? How are chat and Q&A made accessible? Are there phone options if you're using Zoom? Because for some people, the phone is still the best. And does it play well with screen readers? Is it compatible with screen readers? So there are a lot of tech considerations when considering your platform, and there are pros and cons, my understanding is, to every single one. And when you choose one, you just work with its accessibility and understand the pros and cons of it, and the needs, and work with the needs of your constituents around those. So once you've chosen a platform, the next set of considerations for remote meetings or meetings with remote participation is really to prepare for moderation issues. So moderation issues come up in every meeting. You guys are probably pros at them. But in a remote meeting, it's great, as Julia did, to let everyone know the accessibility features. I think Lilia also tagged them in the chat and talked about chat, how to access them, how to pin them, to introduce interpreters, to lay the ground rules for switching interpreters. If there are ASL interpreters, they often switch off every 10 minutes or so. And so you want to notice when that's happening and moderate around that. It's really important to have a plan for people participating remotely as to how to include them. And often what folks do is appoint either a board member or a staff member to watch to see if anyone's raising their live hand or virtual hand, or to check in with remote participants to see if anyone wants to speak, if this is a meeting which allows for participation. As we've been trying to do, ask people to identify themselves before they speak. And again, consider exactly how chat is going to function. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Julia.
Thanks, Ann. So Ann just talked about what to think about when you're having a remote meeting or when you already are planning for remote participation. But one of the big questions that we've been seeing from municipalities lately is, when might remote participation be appropriate? Right now our open meeting law is temporarily allows remote open meetings. That we know that expires at the end of the month. We don't know what's happening next with that. But remote participation as a reasonable modification is different from remote participation under the COVID extender measures, right? So remote participation as a reasonable modification to policies, practices, and procedures is always going to be permissible at both public meetings under the open meeting law and at town meeting. And just to emphasize that that is as a reasonable accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act and state law. So that remote participation, because as a reasonable modification, isn't going to change the nature of the meeting. It's not going to make the meeting hybrid or remote. It's just a reasonable modification for one individual that you're granting on a case-by-case basis, or multiple individuals, but a reasonable modification that you're allowing on a case-by-case basis. So it doesn't impact how you're going to notice the meeting. If you are aware that some folks are going to request remote participation because of their disability, you do not need to change the way you're noticing your meeting as a hybrid meeting or as a remote meeting. So for example, if you're hosting a town meeting, it would be noticed as in person, the same, the same as you always would, but you might allow reasonable accommodations as a one-off for certain people to participate remotely. So this can be really confusing for towns, and I hope that explaining it this way is not adding to the confusion and is going to reduce the anxiety around this. But what we're here to tell you today is that allowing remote participation as an accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act does not turn your meeting into a remote meeting or a hybrid meeting. If it was noticed as an in-person meeting, it's still an in-person meeting with certain people participating remotely because of their disability as an accommodation. And remote participation might be appropriate for various types of disabilities, right? So folks, these days we often see requests to participate remotely due to immunodeficiency or immune health concerns. There are other reasons that remote participation might make sense for some people because of their disability. If they have mobility related disabilities and it's really difficult to get out of the house or to travel or to access your meeting location in person, it might make more sense for them to participate remotely. if they have certain medical needs that require attention, medication that needs to be administered during the meeting, it might make sense for them to participate remotely. So this remote participation really needs to be determined as a reasonable accommodation on a case-by-case basis. There isn't going to be a bright line rule. And the Americans with Disabilities Act expects you to evaluate each one of these individually for each person, for each meeting. So, there isn't sort of a class of people who are always going to be allowed to participate remotely. You have to take these as one-offs. We're going to talk a little bit about town meetings. And we have a lot of questions, so we're going to get to the questions very shortly, I promise. So when you're thinking about planning your town meeting, and I know a lot of towns are starting their process of thinking about town meeting around this time of year. So make sure that when you're selecting your venue, you're going to be hosting the meeting in a physically accessible location. I've heard from towns that have said, we don't have an accessible meeting space that's big enough to host town meeting. And as Anne alluded to earlier, we can help you with that. We have a grant program for municipalities to do capital improvements to make their facilities more accessible to people with disabilities. So if that would help, please apply for our grant. It opens over the summer. But you need to pick a physically accessible location. If you don't have one that the town owns, find one somewhere else and host it there. Plan ahead for communication access. If you guys know that you're going to be hosting your town meeting on a certain date in May, now go ahead and put in your CART and your ASL requests today so that you know that you're going to have availability of those resources for your meeting if you need them. And you really probably should plan to have CART and ASL for a town meeting as a matter of course, at least CART, because you want this is a meeting that the town is going to be attending. You want maximum participation, you want maximum accessibility for your residents. Remote participation, as I just said, as a reasonable modification for a person with a disability isn't going to turn an in-person meeting, town meeting, into a hybrid or remote meeting. So don't worry that requests to participate in town meeting by, remotely, either by phone, by Zoom, are going to change the nature of your meeting and compromise your compliance with town meeting law. And folks have questions about that. We can definitely talk about that when we get to questions. As you're thinking about potential remote participation in a town meeting or just sort of regular in-person participation at a town meeting, think about what kind of accommodations might be necessary to handle voting. If someone is participating remotely, how are they going to vote on different measures? If your town has provisions for secret ballots, how are you going to handle secret ballots? Because that can be really tricky with remote participation. If someone needs help voting in person, how are you going to handle that? How are you going to handle remote participants speaking during the meeting? Or if someone with a disability has trouble accessing the microphone or the lectern, how are you going to accommodate them so that they can speak during the meeting? If you are going to be allowing remote participation as a reasonable modification, you need to consider the strength of the internet connection in the meeting room. This is really important because that remote participation will become meaningless if it's buffering the whole time, right? So make sure that you have Ethernet because that's going to allow enough bandwidth for someone participating remotely to actually be able to meaningfully access the meeting. And we can, if people have questions about these things, we can please put them in the Q&A. We're gonna go over some resources, and then we have quite a lot of questions pending, so I want to make sure we have time to get to them. So these are some of my favorite resources for kind of municipal compliance, especially around meetings. I have a link to the WCAG guidance on accessible remote meeting platforms that Anne had alluded to earlier. This is going to go through the different options for remote meeting platforms and what the different features are in each of those. It's really good to be aware of what accessibility features your town's preferred meeting platform has, so you can then tailor your accommodations to work with that platform. Considerations for people who are deaf and hard of hearing at remote meetings. This is specifically in the employment context, but it applies, I think, outside of the employment context as well. So that can be really helpful. Department of Justice's Title II Technical Assistance Manual is always one that I turn to for, basically Title II compliance in all aspects. So that's going to cover programmatic access as well as architectural access. A link to information about our Municipal ADA grant program, which, as I and Anne both mentioned, could be a source of funding for accessibility improvements. Also a link to request interpreters and CART from Massachusetts Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. They have a statewide contract that has, pretty good rates for interpreter and CART services. The rates are posted on the website, so you can kind of look ahead and see what you would need to budget for those services. The New England ADA Center also has an excellent Title II action guide that all municipalities should take a look at if you haven't. And it really walks you through ADA compliance from soup to nuts as a municipality. You can also call me, Julia O'Leary. My email is julia.e.o'leary@mass.gov. And my cell phone is on here too. It's 857-214-1081. You can also visit our website, mass.gov/MOD. We have some good resources there. If you visit our YouTube, we have other trainings for municipalities specifically on there. And we have a great training that we did this fall on digital accessibility that might be helpful as you consider the accessibility of your website. So definitely check out our website and our YouTube channel. Lots to see there. It looks like we've got a healthy number of questions. Lilia, can you give us the first question, please?
Yes, absolutely. And also a reminder, you can also raise your hand, your virtual hand, and we can turn on your camera and microphone if you want to ask a question that way. And if you have to leave early, you will get a survey pop up. If you can please fill that out, we really appreciate your feedback. All right, we've got a lot of questions. I'm going to dive right in. Our first question is, if a town is providing a hybrid town meeting, does the audio visual equipment need to be able to support assisted listening systems?
So you don't have to support assisted listening systems across the board as a rule. It's a best practice because it's going to increase accessibility of your meeting. So it's a really good idea to support assisted listening systems if you have that technology in place. If you don't have it in place, it's a good idea to put it in place because it's going to increase the accessibility of your meeting spaces. But there, isn't a universal access requirement. So which means you don't have to sort of proactively make everything accessible to everyone at all times. you do need to respond to requests for reasonable accommodation. So sometimes someone might ask for an assisted listening system. If you are able to, provide that, that's great. If you're not able to provide it because you don't have enough time to install it before the meeting, because you don't have the budget, they can be pretty expensive. At this time, you would need to engage in an interactive dialogue with the person to arrive at an alternative to make sure that they have meaningful access. So you would hesitate to say that you need to be able to support an assisted listening system. It's a good idea to, but if you can't, for logistical or financial reasons, you would need to find another option to help that person meaningfully participate. Anything to add to that, Anne?
No,
Okay.
that's right on point.
Next one, Lilia.
Next question, can you give examples of undue burden? What figures are used to determine undue financial burden? If a town has not been paying for ASL or assistive listening systems or descriptive services and it's not in the budget, it can seem expensive and hence burdensome.
Really good question. This is Julia. I'll take a stab, and then Anne, if you want to add anything. Does that work? Okay. So there isn't really a bright line around undue burden. When a court looks at whether something is when a request is unduly financially burdensome to a government entity, it's going to look at the entire budget for that fiscal year for the entity. And so when you're talking about a municipal budget, that's a pretty big budget. And they're not going to look at sort of individual programs within the municipality's budget. They're going to look at the whole municipality's budget for that fiscal year, and they're going to decide whether they think it's reasonable. And reasonableness is sort of a fluffy term, right? There isn't really a bright line there. It's going to be decided on a case-by-case basis by that judge, by that fact finder. But you should be budgeting. Your town should be budgeting for reasonable accommodations in its budget, and the ADA and the DOJ expects you to be doing that. So you should be anticipating how much you're going to need to spend on ASL interpreters in a fiscal year, and projecting that and baking that into your budget. If you need help with capital improvements like installing an assistive listening system, you can come to MOD for that, and we will help you pay for it with our Municipal ADA grant program. But it's really something that the town has a responsibility to budget for. So it can seem expensive and burdensome, but you have an obligation to be planning ahead to make your town services accessible to people with disabilities. So I think it's a hard argument, especially for communication access, to say that CART or ASL services, which are usually in the range of $100 to $200 an hour, are too expensive for the town. And anything to add to that? Good, awesome, getting through these. Could take the next one, Anne.
Is there an expectation that a resident who wants to attend multiple or many town committee meetings can have a standing accommodation? So for example, it's assumed that for any meeting we hold, we'll have a remote option for that person without them having to inform us each time.
Anne, do you want to take that?
Well, I think there's a part of it that's more in your wheelhouse, which is how to memorialize kind of a standing accommodation. But I would say as an accessibility, from the accessibility and community engagement standpoint, if you have a constituent who has an ongoing need and is going to be at every school board meeting, your plan should be to accommodate them at every school board meeting. So if you know that you have an individual who uses a wheelchair, who goes to every school board meeting, you should make sure your seating accommodates them at every single meeting. They should not have to ask for every single meeting. You should anticipate that. As far as the process for memorializing that, that's a little bit more in Julia's wheelhouse, I think.
Okay, so this is Julia, and how I would memorialize that is in a letter that you then keep a copy of in your files in the town. The ADA coordinator should have, files of record of documenting what reasonable accommodations are being granted. A good way to handle that that's going to reduce the burden on the town negotiating a reasonable accommodation for each meeting that this person wants to participate in and person, so it's not unduly burdensome for that individual to participate in their local government by going through a request process each time, would be to sort of come up with what the reasonable accommodation is going to be. Maybe it's cart services, and then have the person notify a designated person in the town that they're planning to attend that meeting. So that's kind of how I've handled it here at Mass Office on Disability. There's a few people who, regularly come to our events, need the same accommodation every time. If I know that they're coming to the event, I make sure that whatever that accommodation is going to be provided. So I just ask that they give me a heads up that they've registered, and we would, make sure that that same accommodation is in place, and that works pretty well for us administratively. It means I don't have to do an evaluation process every single time, which saves me time and saves my agency money. So, Lilia, next one.
Does MOD have a sample job description for an ADA coordinator?
I don't, but I should. If you want to shoot me an email, julia.e.o'leary@mass.gov, we can talk about it.
Easy enough. Is remote participation a reasonable accommodation for towns with open town meeting? I had thought it was only allowed for towns with representative town meeting.
So it is a reasonable accommodation for any form of meeting. It doesn't matter if it's representative or open. It's always on the table as an accommodation that someone can request. Then the town has to determine whether it's reasonable by sort of looking at the factors that we've talked about. So, what resources does the town have available to host it, allow this person to participate remotely? How are you going to handle voting? How are you going to handle speaking? And kind of go through that analysis of whether it would work administratively. And we've worked with towns on this and kind of problem solved by the each. And I think it's hard to say that remote participation in any form isn't going to be reasonable. So yes, you can have remote participation for both open and representative town meeting, and it doesn't implicate town meeting law. Your town meeting is still being held in person. It's just that this individual is being accommodated as required by federal law. Anything to add to that, Anne? No.
No, I have nothing to add.
Thanks.
It's a good question. If a community member is the sole caregiver of a person with a disability, might that caregiver legitimately request to participate remotely since they can't leave the person they care for?
This is a really hard question. Unfortunately for that caregiver, the ADA applies to people's own disabilities, not to the disabilities of people who they're associated with. So when a town is evaluating whether this request is a request for reasonable modification, the first thing they're going to do is say, is this person asking for something because of their own disability? If the answer is no, then they don't need to grant that accommodation. under the ADA. Do you want to add to that, Anne?
I'll only add that there is a concept of associational discrimination in other areas of disability rights law. So there are cases relating to your association to an individual with a disability and I think even housing. But I'm unaware of any in this context.
You cut out a little bit there, but what Anne was saying was there isn't, even though there's case law about associational discrimination in other areas of disability law, that doesn't apply in the Title II context around open meetings. So no, you wouldn't need to accommodate someone who is a caregiver. You could accommodate them, but you aren't required to by the ADA. Next question, Lillian.
What about town events such as movies or concerts being held in areas that are not accessible to residents with mobility or other issues? We've discussed and brought it up at meetings and are ignored.
Really great question. Anne, do you want me to take it?
I'm happy to let you take it.
I'll take it. So this is Julia. You should have all your events be held in accessible locations, no matter what kind of event it is. It is covered by Title II. Any program service that you're providing as a municipality needs to be accessible. So you should have fun events in accessible locations too, not just, I think town meeting is fun personally, but not just business events. And if you need help making those locations accessible, we've got funding. So,
yeah, Municipal ADA grant. Is there a universal form for the interactive process / dialogue, or do you suggest creating one?
So this is Julia. There's not a universal form because the interactive dialogue is going to be different every single time. So what your goal is to arrive at a solution to this person's, to sort of eliminate the barrier for this person on an individual basis. So it's going to be a conversation, really, and it's best done as a conversation with the person about, how their disability is affecting their ability to meaningfully participate, what that barrier is, what that looks like, and what the solutions are to overcome it. And that's always going to be individualized. So there's never going to be sort of a template for that discussion, because you need to understand that person's individual needs, how their disability affects them, and how it affects them, particularly in this situation. So it's always going to be highly individualized. Anything to add, Anne?
And did you have anything to add? Julia, you cut out a little bit.
Oh, sorry.
No, I didn't have anything to add.
You might have covered this already, but what would be an example for a modification that is not reasonable? So for example, if municipality can cite having to buy door openers and that would be a financial burden, would that be a valid reason for a request for a reasonable modification to be denied?
Do you want to take that, Anne, or do you want me to start?
I'm happy to start by taking it to, this is Anne, to call back Julia's answer, which is from other questions, which is the way to really approach these requests for accommodation is looking for the solution that meets the individual with the disabilities needs. So, from our perspective, a lot, if not most requests are going to be reasonable. And if for some reason you cannot meet them, and that might include a financial barrier, then you work with the individual with the disability to find the substitution for that request. So it's not really about saying no, it's about finding the answer that works for everyone if you can't say yes in limited circumstances. Does that make Julie, I'll turn it over to you now.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So in the case of door openers, it might not be reasonable if someone is requesting that the town install door openers, automatic door openers in town hall in advance of next Tuesday's select board meeting, and you're only giving them, 6 days notice, you probably can't install automatic door openers in 6 days. So you're going to have to figure out another way to get that person access to the meeting in 6 days. That's remote participation. Maybe that's changing the location of the meeting. Like Ann said, your goal is to find a solution, but the exact request that someone puts in might not be practical, especially in the context of meetings and events. It might not be practical on a short turnaround, so you would have to come up with an alternative, but you do need to come up with that alternative.
Thank you. With representative town meeting, does allowing to participate remotely include voting members?
Yes.
Okay. To go back to the question about associational disability, if you accommodated the caregiver in that context, would that potentially have an impact on the notice process under open meeting law, given that there is not current requirement to accommodate that individual? May not be directly relevant to this conversation, but to be cautious about allowing remote access to some individuals of the general public and not others.
Yes, I think there, if you're granting an accommodation not under the Americans with Disabilities Act, you would need to think about notice, and you would want to talk to town council about that. You can definitely, if you have sort of a specific situation where this is happening, I think it's great to talk to the Attorney General's office's municipal division about that, or to, you can give me a call and we can talk through it too. But yes, if it's not under the ADA, I think it could potentially create problems. And it looks like you want to say something.
I was just gonna throw in and say the Attorney General's office has, as probably many of you are aware, has 2 divisions that have 2 different areas of expertise. We have our Division of Open Government, which handles open meeting law issues and covers open public meetings, and we have our municipal law unit that deals with town meeting issues, and they are really experts in those areas of law. My role in the office is from the Civil Rights Division and enforcing our anti-discrimination laws and ensuring that individuals with disabilities have access to public accommodations and housing and employment and their municipalities. And so if you're encountering an issue that involves open meeting, town meeting, and a disability accommodation, as Julia said, you can absolutely contact her, but you can also contact me, and it may very well be that Julia, me, and someone from either our Division of Open Government or our municipal law unit can talk to you about what's going on and see if we can work to find a solution.
Is there a specific time requirement for requesting a reasonable accommodation? I know the Massachusetts trial court publicly posted it's 72 hours for them. Is that universal?
There isn't a universal time requirement. I think it's really helpful to put one, to put one out there, both for the members of the public who are going to be requesting accommodations and for you guys administratively. I know that when there is a deadline, I'm probably not going to submit a request very far ahead of that deadline. I like to sort of skate in at the last minute. So, letting people know that you need requests for accommodations by a certain date will allow you to get to them and meaningfully process them before your meeting. For town, for public meetings, that can be really tricky if you have sort of a last minute meeting with pretty short notice. you know, you want to provide meaningful opportunity for people to request reasonable accommodations while balancing the fact that you're not going to have a lot of time to process those, right? So I like to sort of have a guideline in my meeting notice. For this presentation that we had today, I asked for reasonable accommodation requests by a certain date, and the language that I used was, you know, if any reasonable accommodations requested after that date, you know, might not be possible to fulfill, but we'll still consider them. I mean, that's kind of a good rule of thumb to protect you and make sure that you're not sort of excluding people from requesting accommodations, but also giving you enough time to process them. And do you want to?
Can I just add, I completely agree. And I want to add, it really depends on the accommodation too, because, you know, it may be that it's a request for an ASL interpreter an hour in advance. And, you know, in my experience, at least, you're never going to make that happen. On the other hand, it may just be a front row seat for a person who has hearing aids and would benefit from sitting in the front row to be closer to the microphone. And, you know, so I completely agree. It's great to ask for a request by a certain date to give you time to work on them, to engage in the process, to leave it open for last minute requests, because there are some that you can absolutely make happen, and there are some that are just too difficult.
Right. So it's going to depend on the request.
This is more of a comment, but somebody says CART services are easier to set up for state agencies. There are additional costs associated with CART as a municipality, and also the more rural your municipality, the less likely CART can find a translator.
So you can provide remote CART even at in-person meetings. So that's always an option. And remote CART has been a lot easier to get these days. So definitely look into that. You know, it can be expensive to provide that service, but it's required by law to provide these reasonable accommodations to people. So that's why I think it's so important to build this into your budget. And one thing we've seen here in the state agencies is a turn towards you know, projecting how much you're going to spend on reasonable accommodations in a fiscal year and building that into the agency's budget. And I'm really gratified to see that happening more at the state level. So as you're developing your town budget, think hard about, you know, what kind of events are you needing to provide accommodations at, and what is that costing? What did you spend last fiscal year? So you can project that ahead to the next one. Anything to add to that, Anne?
No, nothing to add to that.
Muted. We have another comment back to the automatic door opener. This person says they're often not required by the ADA, so they wouldn't necessarily be a reasonable accommodation, and they can cost up to $5,000. So I'm going to comment on that.
Okay. They can definitely be expensive. You can ask for grant funding from MOD. And, you know, the most important thing is you need to make sure that your town services are accessible to people with disabilities. So, you know, if you don't have automatic door openers, how are you accommodating people to get into that building?
Next question, is offering phone participation as a remote option acceptable even if the requester wants virtual access?
Yeah, maybe. I think that's why you're going to engage in an interactive dialogue with someone to sort of come up with what works, what's going to be most workable and meet the person's needs and meet the town's needs. So the goal of the interactive process is to arrive at a solution that works for both parties. And so there is a lot of flexibility and wiggle room in there. Anything you want to add, Anne?
No, I agree 100%. it could very well be that the telephone isn't the first choice, but it meets the need and it's an acceptable second choice. But I'm sure Julia and I could both come up with a circumstance where the telephone would not meet the need, and then you'd have to keep talking and looking for a solution that would meet the need.
So it's going to depend on the person and their disability and the meeting, right?
Another part to that question, if a member of a public body such as city council or a commission meeting requests for remote participation, can that member also request to be considered part of the necessary quorum for that meeting?
I would want to talk to the Attorney General's office about that. I think, Angie, can you talk to that? Can you speak to that?
I think that I wouldn't opine on that because I'm not in, is this town meeting or open? I'm not in DOG or MLU.
Yeah.
So that is not my area of expertise. No.
But shoot us if that has happened in your municipality and you're trying to figure out how to handle that situation, shoot me an email and I'll put my head together with them and we can come up with a solution, because you do need to make your municipal boards accessible to people with disabilities. So your commission and board members are entitled to reasonable accommodations the same way that members of the public are. So how you balance that, I would want to talk to probably to DOG about, but please shoot me an email, julia.e.o'leary@mass.gov, and we can talk about it.
All right, it looks like we have one more question. I also want to remind everybody you'll get a survey when you close out. Please fill that out. We take a look at your feedback to help inform us on improving our future trainings and events. So we want to know what you're looking for from us. Last question, could MOD consider offering training opportunities for writing good alt text for graphics and describing graphs, maps, and visuals, etc., live at meetings?
Yep, I'd love to do training on that. That's a really good idea. We will note that down.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that idea.
And thank you all for attending. If you have other follow-up questions, I'll put the page with my email address back up here. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We really want to be here to support our municipalities. We're planning on doing quarterly trainings at Mass Office on Disability. And just to keep in mind, we are planning an ADA coordinator resource group. It's in the planning stages, so stay tuned. Make sure that you're on our email list if you aren't already, and we will be sending out information about that as we get that more together. So thank you all for attending.
Julia,
yeah.
Did you see one more question came in on the Q&A?
How about meetings held by municipalities for staff members, not the public? Is card required to be provided for staff who are hard of hearing? Yeah, maybe. So that would be covered by Title I of the ADA, which we didn't talk about today. I do have a recording that covers both Title I and Title II on our YouTube page for Municipal ADA Coordinators. I think it's called Municipal ADA Coordinators Basics Training. Definitely check that out. But yes, employers do have responsibility to provide reasonable accommodations for employees. We also field questions about that here at MOD. So if you have a specific employee-related issue that you want to talk about, feel free to give me a call about that as well. And looks like that's it. So thank you all for attending. Thank you so much to Anne for joining us today. It's always wonderful to have you here. And thank you to Lilia for moderating. And have a great day, everyone.
Thank you for the applause.
Yeah.
Thank you for inviting me. It's always lovely to join you guys at MOD.
Thank
Take
you.
care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.